right, I'm sure some folks will still continue to come in, but let's get started. I want to welcome everyone to our second speaker series event as part of our Accelerating Climate Resiliency program, generously funded by the Barr Foundation. Thanks very much to them. I am Cami Peterson. I am the Director of Clean Energy at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and I'll take you through a few logistics and then we'll set the foundation for today's speaker series event. So Ella, you can go on to the next slide. Here are some Zoom logistics for everyone just to look over. I know everyone is very familiar with Zoom these days, but I do just want to note that everyone will be on mute, but you are welcome to enter questions in the chat box. The most of today's event will be a conversation between my colleague Van Du and our speaker, Jacqueline Patterson, but we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So I encourage you to enter questions in the chat as you think of them throughout the conversation, and we'll get to as many as possible as we can after that conversation. As I mentioned, you will remain on mute though throughout, so those questions in the chat will be where we find your questions. I also want to note that if there are any disruptive comments, as you see here on the screen, or questions or other activity, we reserve the right to expel anyone at any point. And similarly, if need be, we may need to end the meeting early, and we'll follow up with participants if that's the case, though I do not anticipate that happening. I know everyone will be on their best behavior. Let's go on to the next slide. As you heard when you entered the room here, we are recording this event. We hope that you'll be able to watch the conversation again, refer back to it at a later time, share it with others, and it will also be available on our website within a few days following today's event. You can go on to the next slide. So as I mentioned at the top, this is part of our speaker series here at MAPC, generously funded by the Barr Foundation. MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, we are the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns of Greater Boston. We're a mission-based public agency. We were founded by the legislature over 50 years ago, focused on smart growth and sustainability. We have strategic objectives that center on regional coordination, equity, and climate, and departments in clean energy, environment, public health, and many more that focus on climate and equity and more in their work every day. The program that you're seeing this speaker series as a part of is our Accelerating Climate Resiliency program, where in partnership with the Barr Foundation, we are working hard to accelerate climate resilience in the region by helping municipalities advance strategies that protect people, places, and communities from the impacts of climate change. Our intent through the program is to provide grants that fund actionable resilience interventions that facilitate long-term innovative changes, leading to greater readiness for climate change. In particular, we seek to elevate projects that advance climate equity, regional coordination, and social cohesion. As part of our Accelerating Climate Resiliency program, we also have two more components: the Resilience Community of Practice, which is a peer-to-peer sharing network among the grantees of our program that enables them to exchange best practices and lessons learned and collectively problem solve. And we also are offering this new speaker series. This is the second event in this series. It's open to the public every other month. And in this series, we seek to bring in experts and practitioners from around the country on issues related to climate resilience. And with that, I wanted to note that one of the primary objectives of our Accelerating Climate Resilience program is to center equity in the communities most impacted within our drive to advance climate resilience and mitigation and make our communities healthier and more prepared. So I'm so excited and honored today to welcome Jacqueline Patterson as the speaker for this month's speaker series event. Here you can take down that slide, Ella. Just want to provide a little background on Jackie. Jackie is the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She is also the coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. Jackie has worked as a researcher, a program manager, and an activist working on women's rights, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, and climate justice for many years. She holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in public health from Johns Hopkins University. She currently serves on the International Committee of the U.S. Social Forum, the Steering Committee for Interfaith Moral Action on Climate, the Advisory Board for the Center for Earth Ethics, and on the boards of directors for the Institute of the Black World, Center for Story-Based Strategy, and the U.S. Climate Action Network, among many other organizations that she participates in or supports. Among Jackie's many publications and articles, she has authored Climate Change is a Civil Rights Issue, Disasters, Climate Change Uproot Women of Color, and Just Energy Policies, Reducing Pollution, Creating Jobs. It is so wonderful to have you here today, Jackie. We thank you so much for joining us. I'm now going to turn the conversation over to my esteemed colleague, Senior Environmental Planner Van Du, who will lead the conversation with Jackie Patterson, as well as moderate the Q&A that follows. As I mentioned, you can feel free to enter questions in the chat, We will cull through these and Van will get to as many as she can following their conversation. Over to you, Van.
Great. Thank you so much. I just want to first thank you, Cami Peterson and Ella Weiss, for all your hard work putting this event together, organizing and inviting Jackie Patterson to this conversation today. And just quickly, I'm a little starstruck because I got to read a little piece of a chapter by Jackie in the All We Can Save book recently, and it's really wonderful. And so it's really great to have Jackie here today. Welcome, Jackie. And so let's just start the conversation. We would love to hear more about the National Association for Advancement of Colored People and NAACP. So Jackie, could you tell us a little bit more about the organization as well as the vision of the, or the work of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, which you are leading?
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, and so first, it is an honor to be here. A joy to speak with you, Van, and an honor to be here as part of this conversation and know you're all out there. So, yeah, the NAACP was first off founded in 1909, and over the years, it has, during that time, of course, focused on issues such as voting rights, education, justice, and so forth. And then over the years, it's evolved to have programs around health, criminal justice, and um, and then a youth a program focused on engaging youth, civic engagement, and so forth. And the environmental and climate justice program is the youngest program. So it was just started in 2009, which was the 100-year anniversary of the organization. And so it's a good time, yeah. And so we just celebrated our 11th anniversary last year. And so the program is focused on it started with a focus on climate justice, in particular, and with this notion of working on the engagement of African Americans on climate change, because it started out of this commission to engage African Americans on climate change. But quickly, I started to reframe that conversation basically to say that in some ways we've been involved, in mitigation of climate change just by our lifestyles for a long time before it even started to be talked about as climate change. And so now the program has evolved, and it intersects environmental and climate justice, and it works on everything from equity and disaster mitigation to sea level rise to food justice to energy justice and so forth. And we have 2,200 branches and chapters across the country, and so our focus is to work with our branches, chapters, our state leadership, and to support their leadership and their vision, for their communities.
That's great. I want to take a step back, and I think many of us have heard about the term environmental justice, but I think the climate justice is a little bit newer. And so, with that, I recently saw that the NAACP statement is that, environmental and climate justice is a civil rights issue. So could you elaborate, or could you share with us a little bit more in terms of, what is climate justice, and then why is climate integral to promoting civil justice and equity?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, climate justice is so it really is kind of a subset of environmental justice, which, as we know, environmental justice is the unequal distribution of the benefits and burdens around environment. And similarly with climate justice, it is this unequal distribution of the in terms of disproportionate impacts of climate change on certain frontline communities, whether it's communities that are in certain geographic areas, communities that have pre-existing vulnerabilities because of society in terms of racial and ethnic groups, or populations such as immigrant populations who don't have necessarily access to the same services as others, or especially folks who are undocumented. And gender is also a challenge as well. So it's really about the disproportionate impact, but then it also is about the power in making a change. So climate justice is about the fact that that the folks who are most impacted are the ones who are the least responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change, and B, it's about the fact that as decision making happens around it, decision making around our energy choices, decision making around our transportation, and so forth, that the very same communities that are least responsible, most impacted, are least engaged in decision making. So this is where we see climate justice.
Right. Great. So what are some of, or what are the NAACP's climate priorities, and or, any any initiatives or efforts that you're passionately working on currently?
Yeah, sure. So we work along with, as members of the Climate Justice Alliance, we work under this overarching frame around what's called just transition. And so we recognize that our current economy is rooted in extractive processes, extraction, domination, exploitation, as we've seen with everything from the ways that our natural resources are recklessly extracted to the ways that communities are exploited in terms of communities being disproportionately hosting these toxic facilities, to the ways that domination happens in terms of the lack of real democracy, because we have a corporatocracy that's dominating the decision making in our legislatures and even courtrooms and onward. So our just transition framework that we work in with our partners in this work around with Climate Justice Alliance and others, is moving from an extractive economy to what's called a living economy, and living economy where we move away from these principles and practices of extraction, exploitation, domination, and move into principles that are rooted in a caring economy, caring for the sacred, caring for each other, a cooperative economy, and one that is rooted in deep democracy. And so that's kind of our overarching kind of shift that we think we need to make as a society, and what we're always trying to make sure our systems are shifting towards. And then we, as the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, uh, have as our one of our primary goals now is to, by 2025, to have all of our 2,200 branches and chapters engaged in some way or another around this work. We feel if people are focused on this, then we will then that's a start to get to have these conversations about the larger shift that we need to make. And then from there, we are focused on these three strategic objectives. One is to reduce harmful emissions, particularly greenhouse gases, and really we want a GHG free economy to the extent that we could do that. And then and really we're focusing not just on greenhouse gases, but also the co-pollutants. And that's why we're the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, because we don't want to myopically focus on greenhouse gas emissions when there are all these other emissions that are harming communities. Our second objective is to advance energy efficiency and clean energy policies and practices, because we know that energy is one of the major emitters of so many of these pollutants that are harming people and planet. So we want to make sure that there's an alternative. And, with the energy sector being a $7 trillion industry, we see it as critical to shifting our economy and moving us away from this corporatocracy, of which the fossil fuel actors are some of the major players in that. And then our third objective is to strengthen community resilience in the context of climate adaptation. So, we're recognizing that climate change is happening now. It's already impacting folks now. So we want to, and we talked about who's disproportionately impacted. So we want to make sure that those communities are able to to be resilient to those impacts, and so we're working on that. So those are kind of our three overarching objectives, and under each one, under reducing harmful emissions, we do everything from protection and defense of the Clean Air Act, or making sure that our communities are engaged in zoning board meetings and so forth. And then we also we work with our communities to pass clean air ordinances at the municipal level. We also have a youth scientist project where we work with youth, connect them with local universities, and help them to get trained in testing their own air quality, their water quality, their soil quality, and then working towards passing legislation at the youth-led legislation at the local level to address those issues. Around advancing energy efficiency and clean energy, we have our Power to the People campaign, which includes our solar equity initiative, where we're getting as many solar installations on low income household rooftops, working with low income communities and getting solar installations on their community centers, and then also working with job seekers to be able to get trained and placed in solar job opportunities. And we also have our Power Up Employment Project, also under the Power to the People campaign. And the Power Up Employment Project works with formerly incarcerated persons and those at risk to to train them in energy efficiency retrofits and weatherization, as well as solar installations. And so we do that work, as well as push for the policies like local hire provisions, disadvantaged business enterprise provisions, fair chance hiring, to make sure that as we move into this new energy economy, it is one where everyone has an opportunity to participate in the new energy economy. And then around strengthening community resilience in the context of climate adaptation, we have everything from our just and equitable response to sea level rise certification program, where we actually train people on how to assess their risks for sea level rise, how to have the conversation at the local level about what kind of remedies they want, whether it's infrastructure planning or it is managed retreat, and how they make sure that they're in the driver's seat when managed retreat is happening. So it's not something that they're being relocated, and as opposed to themselves being at the driver's seat in terms of their moving. And then we also have our just our equity in emergency management certification program. So we help people to understand the disaster response systems, how to be prepared, how to have more equitable response, and how to have more equitable recovery, including working against the post disaster long term displacement and gentrification that even happens. So those are some of the examples. I mean, there's many more because we do have 2,200 branches and chapters. So we want to make sure we have a broad menu for people to engage, but those are some of the highlights. Thank you.
It's amazing. There's so much going on. Um, what thinking about climate adaptation and building, enhancing community resilience. So one of the a program at MAPC is the Accelerating Climate Resilience Program. One of which we support communities, municipalities, with their climate resilience projects and building capacity, whether it's building capacity or technical assistance or capital improvements in that work as well. One of the priorities of the program is to build resiliency and cohesion. And so in these projects, we ask our communities to design their projects through an equity lens, connecting with community members, identifying, creating dialogues, identify the members, the community-based organizations that should come together and have this collective, collaboration and partnerships together. What advice do you have for them to have that effectively plan and implement an equitable engagement? And with that, how do we build trust to engage those that we have not been able to get to the table before?
Yeah, thank you. I would recommend a couple of resources, because there's a few things I can tell you in this soundbite, but then I would want to just refer folks to learn more. One is the community-driven resilience planning guide that the Movement Strategy Center put together, and they're facilitating a group of us who are now called the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And so definitely would recommend both being a part of that network and that particular tool that talks about some of the ways, practices of community engagement and so forth. I would also recommend our communities, our power toolkit, which was based on, in terms of practices, based on the practices in the because we were part of NAACP, the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners, and because we were part of the formation of the community-driven resilience planning document. So it's based on some of those practices, but then goes in a little bit deeper on how we apply that to different situations. I would also recommend we put together this document called "And the People Shall Lead," and it was based on we were part of this conference around retiring coal plants, and they asked us to do a session on how to engage underrepresented populations or something like that. And so we were saying, well, it's not, we really need to kind of reverse that frame and think about like how do we meet people where they are, because people have already, as I said before, been doing this, and they're not necessarily talking your language or have access to your tables, but how do you make sure that you're bringing folks together? So I would definitely recommend those resources to get some tips.
That's great. Um, it's it's not an elephant in the room because it's still happening, even though we're at the end of it. But COVID-19 pandemic, it exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities and injustice, in our systems, in our society. And so, are there lessons that we could learn, that we could apply, learn and apply to the environmental and climate justice work? And how do we encourage this transformation, these changes post-pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the biggest lessons that we learned is what's possible. Like I think that there's a lot of lack of vision, lack of ambition in terms of the scale and depth of the changes that we need to make, and the COVID-19 and the ways that we had to completely transform our systems and so forth. In some ways, showed that it's possible to do that. That we learned also that uh, the, that these systemic underpinnings of COVID-19 in terms of, I mean, when we, on March the 9th, I wrote this document. I spent 19 hours straight writing this document called The 10 Equity Implications of COVID-19. And that was March the 9th. That was before it had gotten really beyond at that point in terms of the way people are talking about it, beyond kind of Washington State, or and maybe the hotspot in New York was coming online. But I but but because of working on climate and other issues, like the writing was on the wall in terms of how this was going to unfold, and people afterwards were referring to it as prophetic, but it was very far from that. All you have to do is be a frontline community member to see that those lines of societal um, just what do you call it? Well, inequities are
Mhm.
exactly the same ones that are going to leave folks most vulnerable. So I think that it also that uh, taught us about the Steve Benjamin said basically what you just said as you opened the question was that COVID-19 served as an X-ray to expose the broken bones of American society, and I think that is exactly one of the lessons that we did learn, that it's deep, it's systemic, and that each of the shocks that we get to society, whether it's Katrina or COVID or any of these other challenges, that it's always gonna, like, the same fault lines are always gonna be underneath that are exacerbated during these times. So I think, yes, both in terms of recognizing the systemic nature and recognizing the need for systemic change, and recognizing what's possible if we put our mind and our political will to it, are some of the lessons that we learned. We also learned that our economy is in some ways, I mean, that the way the economy is designed is, well, we know is extractive, but that there are certain things that there's more of a conversation now around things like universal basic income, or kind of it was served as kind of a bit of an equalizer in terms of there are the folks underneath society, kind of not even visible in society, who've been suffering from these challenges for as long as they've been in existence. But then COVID-19 brought other people who weren't necessarily suffering from some of these challenges into a similar situation, and then there's this kind of, okay, well, then we all need to get these stimulus checks, or we all need to, because of that equalizing. And so I think thinking going forward in terms of universal basic income, or other types of having moratorium on electricity shutoffs. Like, yes, we should have it during COVID-19, but there's people who are always under threat of energy insecurity. So we're always under threat of water insecurity. So there's more of a question of like making these things permanent, because there's no time when it's accessible. I mean, when it's acceptable to turn somebody's electricity off or turn someone's water off. So that's a long answer to a short question, but
No, it's great.
I've given it a lot of thought.
Yeah, no, this is great. This is the time where we can feel so there's excitement of changes is coming, but there, as you mentioned before, all these connectedness of issues and problems. I personally feel sometimes overwhelmed and I think like many paralyzed, almost kind of like, what do we start? So with that, like, what are you feeling hopeful about? Like, what are you looking forward to? Like, what is this transformation that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, thank you. I am. One thing I'm feeling hopeful about is that uh, people people are thinking more transformation. That people are have expanded vision and possibilities and imagination, and so that makes me feel like this whole notion of dismantling and restructuring the police departments, like recognizing that the way things have been you don't have to be the way things are going forward, and also recognizing that we can't just tweak a system that's fundamentally flawed at its core, and that it's actually doing exactly what it was designed to do. Not just that it's a system that's not working, it is working the way it was supposed to work, but the way it's supposed to work isn't working for a lot of the people. And so that's something that folks are recognizing at a deeper level now. And so that gives me hope that, as they say, people, you can't change there's a good quote from, I think, James Baldwin, that something about you, that nothing can not everything can be changed. Everything that you face can be changed, but you can't change it if you don't face it. Anyway, there's a good quote that I'm totally botching, but basically, the fact that we're recognizing this problem is a good start to actually starting to see some hope of changing, because the hope was dim before, because people weren't even seeing that there was a problem to a large extent, unless they were kind of the ones who were, you know
Yeah.
on the front lines of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to get back to our region, MEPC is a regional planning agency, and we work closely with, there's 101 communities, municipalities in our region. And climate change and racial justice can feel such enormous problems. And so what would you say to the folks in our community, the advocates and the municipal staff, about how work at the local level can make change and promote climate justice?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so first I would say that it's really only the work that the work of the local level is our only hope of being able to actually have that change, because being proximate to the issues is the is the key to political will. As they say, all politics are local. Like, if we're like when we're actually having a conversation about what it is we want at the local level, which is why so much of our work is focused on like local visioning, local branches working with their municipalities, and really this notion of creating 1,000 points of light, because at the local level it's easier to kind of illuminate what our vision is, what we want, and what the pathways are to get there, than when we're trying to think, kind of at the federal level. And we need to be really modeling at the local level, so that by the time it reaches the federal level, it just is like, this is the way things are, this is the way things should be. So let's legislate it to actually support what the visions are that have been developed locally. And so when I see work like the conversations around restructuring the police that are happening in Minneapolis or Baltimore, when I see work like what's happened in forget which coastal area in California where they're talking about reparations and giving land back that was taken from Black folks in some of those areas. When I see the work that's happened around developing in places like Seattle and San Francisco, where they've developed an entire recycling, recovery, reuse, and recycling program, to really to make that the norm at the municipal level. When I see work like the Boston Resilience Plan, that's rooted in racial justice, like that's not, that wouldn't have even been a possibility, but now, thanks to the leadership of there, we see a resilience plan that now I use when I go and I talk to other municipalities and say this is possible. This is what they've done in Boston. You can draw from this example. And so municipality after municipality, we're seeing places that are rising up and making these types of changes, and it's because of using tools like the community driven resilience planning tool. Because when in Portland, the Portland Clean Energy Fund is another excellent example where communities came together and said we can do this tax on all revenue that's going through from these businesses, and use that to invest in communities. Not a carbon tax. Definitely not in favor of that. But it's a tax on just kind of all goods and services in Portland. And now they have a community driven fund to support the work that's happening there. And so place after place, we're seeing where people are finding a way. They're being visionary and then finding those pathways and doing it. So I would just, and one of the reasons why we're all, like with our communities, our power toolkit, it's a series of places of kind of ideas, and then all the places that have already done it, so that we can help folks to be able to say these are the models, and just take this and customize it to what you want to do, or think of something completely new. So all of those, so I would say yes, definitely, drawing on what's already happening, being visionary, being community rooted, thinking. We're Another thing that we're actually coming out with is this resourcing revolutionary resistance and resilience toolkit, which is all about, it's part of our transformational climate finance model. Because I know a lot of times that becomes a barrier. People say, well, we want to do this, but where's the money for it? So we're helping municipalities to know how they can use everything from social impact investing to municipal bonds to various little known federal programs that are out there and available for municipalities. So basically, if we have a kind of an idea, there's a way to resources, and we're helping folks to kind of know what those paths might be.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to start opening up. We have a lot of great questions. I want to get to at least as many of them as possible as well. So just kind of going on that same conversation locally, how do you think land use planning in zoning specifically can be used as a tool of climate justice?
Thank you. Yeah, that's another quote from Martin Luther King where he says, "Judicial decrees cannot create heart, but they can restrain the heartless." And so one of the things with zoning is helping to make, and of course not everyone, heartless can be a little bit extreme in certain situations, but one of the places that we have had some challenges is around gentrification and displacement. I know you've seen the similar, and so one of the tools that people have used around to guard against gentrification has been some of these inclusionary zoning practices, and folks like Shelter Force and Right to the City are good places to go to see how some of these zoning policies have been used. Also, the Lincoln Land Institute and also the Urban Institute, they all have some great places to go to see, to provide some examples. And in our Resourcing Revolutionary Resistance and Resilience Toolkit, we actually are going to have some models around that too. I think we already have some for sure in our communities, our power, but and we're also, I mentioned the 2 certification programs we have around emergency management and sea level rise, we're actually doing a certification program around land justice. So stay tuned, and so we'll have a lot more drawing from those great leaders who are in this field on this particular question. So.
Great. Okay, and this question, it's a big one, so I'm going to just go ahead and read it. So how is the NAACP working with labor on reducing harmful emissions? Have you navigated challenges with unions that represent gas, oil, and coal workers who feel that this objective inherently threatens their job? And do you have any words of wisdom for the advocate groups that seek to work with labor on this just transitions to kind of the greenhouse gas free economy, cleaner economy?
Thank you. That was a long one and
yeah.
and a good one. So we actually started the Black Labor Initiative on Just Transition because of this very topic. Because we found ourselves talking about reducing harmful emissions, and we found ourselves talking about advancing energy efficiency and clean energy, and then we were concerned that we were not, like, a lot of people kind of bandy about this term just transition, but if you're not being led by the workers who are in, on the front lines, then we're not following our own Hermes principles around frontline folks leading for themselves. And so we put together that group with this explicit purpose of saying, okay, we want to make sure that we are that we're working together on this. And so the conversation, has gotten thorny for sure. But with it being Black labor, what's been interesting is that there's a combination of having the most job insecurity, often being on the front lines of the most harmful line in terms of those companies that they're working in terms of the oil and gas and coal and so forth, and then also being in the very communities that are harmed by these practices. And so we've really been able to have some honest conversations about abundance and really pushing back on the myth of scarcity. Like there is real scarcity, but in some ways it's because of the lack of distribution and also the lack of political will to harness the and harvest the abundance. and so and so we have the situation where it's either jobs or health, or the people are claiming in terms of these choices that are really false choices. It's possible for us to have jobs for all and high road jobs for all, and also be able to have the health, the environmental health that we need. And so these are the conversations that we've been having. Like, how do we do this? And in some cases, we've said, we're not going to try to convince you of this or that, but the fact is that even if our environmental concerns weren't there, that the markets are putting coal out of business, at the for better or worse. And so what are we going to do together to make sure that you are whole in this transition that's happening, that none of us are able to control. And so that's the vein in which we come to the table together around this. And then we certainly pepper in conversations around the change of the planet and how there are other reasons why this shift would probably be. And so, but yeah, we don't want them to feel like we've brought them to the table so we can proselytize and and kind of indoctrinate them into thinking that their livelihoods have been harming people for decades. You know what I mean? So that's not the kind of conversation that's been useful. The conversation that's been useful has been about how this is happening. How do we make sure that you are whole in this? And so we've made sure that when we put together the 100% building blocks document, coming fresh out of a conversation with the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and the United Mine Workers of America in the context of the Black Labor Initiative, we were able to say that we need to put right next to the renewable portfolio standards and the energy efficiency resource standards that there has to be pension preservation for displaced workers. There has to be health insurance guaranteed for displaced workers and their families. There has to be a high road job guarantee. So because one of the things that they were saying when we were talking was, just you telling me that I'm going to get another job isn't enough. Like, I don't want to, I've been making six figures and this is what my and supporting my family through this. You can't convince me that to just kind of leap out on faith when you might be giving me a job flipping burgers. And so we had to get very specific in the building block document to say, like, this is what the transition that's needed, and if people are going to retire, these are the specific things that should be put in place. If people are want to be retrained, this is exactly how it has to go in order for people to feel like they're being held and honored and respected for what they've given in this industry all of this time, and that they're actually treasured in what's going to happen next for them. So that's all to say the Black Labor Initiative on Just Transition has been a good conversation for us. There's other initiatives like the Blue Green Alliance. Sierra Club has a labor division, and but the reason that we decided to do the Black Labor Initiative is because none of those places, like, even in the history of the labor movement, Black folks have been marginalized within some of the labor unions. So we also wanted to make sure that they felt like their voice was being equally heard, and so then they take that back to their unions, the conversations that we have with the Black Labor Initiative, and make sure that it's a integrated conversation with what's happening at with their unions as well. So it's been great. Hopefully that kind of gets us.
Yeah, that's great. And so there's another questions and kind of following on to that. As you mentioned before, and we starting to notice more that, folks who are mostly impacted by climate change have contributed the least greenhouse gas emissions. There's definitely that disproportion. Any advice on how to talk to the more affluent communities that, about the to stepping up and or any inequitable contributions to climate change, or how, how can they be part of this conversation that is more collective?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. So yes. One of the things that we, without kind of, it's been an interesting conversation around not wanting to fear monger or give folks the, like, so some of the times people will use this kind of security or this fear to say, if you don't do something about it, the people who are most impacted will come for you, or whatever, because yeah. And so that's the kind of where it's like, we certainly want folks to feel that they're, the whole, these quotes, no one is free if one is oppressed, or there's the Lily Watson Indigenous woman from Australia who said, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because you feel that your liberation is bound with mine, then let's walk together. So we really are trying to kind of thread that needle of, you can't really tell someone that their liberation is tied to yours, but helping people to see how we're all in the same sea, and we all, that we all, to have this sense of interdependence and so forth. And so a lot of that again starts with these local conversations, because people feel that relationship, and so that has been helpful. And I just got off the phone the other day with this wealthy couple who has really said that they feel that they want to contribute to making sure that they feel like they've seen, especially in the conversation that's happening, that their wealth has had an inverse relationship with with other folks, like that their wealth has been on the backs of others in some ways. And so that so they start to see that there needs to be a distribution of wealth. And so that was a positive conversation. But then also recognizing that it's not going to harm them to do so, but it's going to, it makes it, and it's not just kind of out of guilt either, but it's just out of kind of returning things to right and making things right. There's another person who was telling me that he's a part of a group of people who are coming together, and they have started a reparations fund where they're basically tithing, a certain percent of their resources to give into funds for Black liberation, as another example. Other folks who are having conversations with Indigenous folks, recognizing, all the extreme harms there. And so I think lifting up those examples, I think is going to be important, so people can kind of see that there's a way that you can have a shared sense of community with folks that you can, without harming. And we've seen where people like hear that other people are doing this, and they're inspired and move into this work. So those are just a couple of examples of where it's happening and how we need to continue to lift up those examples so that others can be inspired as they see someone who has similar circumstances and has been enlightened in such a way. Yeah. And then the other thing that happens is that some of them, like just like the group of folks who have come together and decided they're also doing outreach with others to try to get others to be a part of, and they're growing that circle. So having kind of people who are in like circumstances actually not only doing it themselves, but being a bit evangelical in terms of helping to model for others more explicitly. So.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the greener economy, there's a question. What are your thoughts or NAACP's view of engagement with local Green New Deal initiatives and regional Green New Deal coalitions? What would be your advice to folks working on this in this policy space?
Yeah, I think first off, to really think about the principled aims of the Green New Deal, which is, kind of liberty and justice for all kind of notions, and then really think about like interpreting that to what it actually means at the local or state level, so that because so that as it's being customized to that context, that there aren't loopholes or there aren't unaddressed issues, because people, the more localized it is and the more we focus on what's going to happen for that context, the better it's going to be in terms of having a strong, tight policy that actually addresses the needs of that community, that then becomes something that can be customized to other contexts. I think that's what's most important, because to really take the aspirations and be very deliberative, again, through community-driven resilience planning, to make those aspirations the reality in a way that doesn't leave things to chance. So it's one thing when we talk about, so for example, clean energy, like we need to be thinking about what those definitions are, so that we don't have things that are slipping in that aren't actually that will have harms if we're not kind of tight about our definitions, as an example. So that's all to say that I think Green New Deal is a good framework in terms of aspirations, and we need that community-driven resilience planning so that the actual specifics of it don't leave things to interpretive chance. Is what I would say. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Another question. What tools are you using or recommending to use to best make sure all voices are being heard when reaching out to or within an environmental justice community or environmental justice communities?
Yeah, thank you. So in addition to the frameworks and the things that are laid out in the community-driven resilience planning document, one of the things that I have been really talking about a lot, particularly with now, folks might be aware of the Justice 40 initiative, where they're trying to make sure that at least 40% of the resources that are coming down for infrastructure goes to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about, that I've really been on a bandwagon about, I would say, is that when we're defining disadvantaged communities, it doesn't become kind of.
Oh, I think you accidentally got on mute.
Yeah, the host muted me.
Oh no. Oops.
Yeah. So what often happens is that in some of these resources, it's the folks who are online looking at this website, X website, to see um, what resources are available, or people. So basically, we don't want to kind of make it so that that people can check the box that 40% of the resources went to disadvantaged communities, while there are all these communities. I think about communities like Sand Branch, Texas, where we're doing some work now, where, whether it's been Ford or Carter or Reagan or Clinton or the Bushes or whatever, like those communities haven't changed in decades and decades, like no matter what administration has been in place. So I'm thinking of communities that are not even marginalized, because they're not even on the margins, they're just not even on the map. And so that's a place where, you know where the community driven resilience planning is kind of with this notion that the community has already been identified, and it's already, and so then we use this tool to engage people who are in that community. I just would kind of challenge us all to try to make sure that we know where all the communities are, and that we design pathways starting with the community that is not on the map, and then it's, as opposed to thinking that a rising tide lifts all boats, recognizing that some folks aren't even in boats. And so that would be something I would do. But in terms of tools, I would definitely say the community driven resilience planning tools would be the way to go.
This is so great. I'm so grateful to be able to have this conversation with you. And with 3 minutes left, I think one last question that I would love to hear from you, and I'm sure everyone too, is, with this, as the region embarks on important work of advancing climate and racial equity, what are some final thoughts, some leaving remarks? What would you like to leave with us?
Yeah, thank you. I would definitely say to lean into the HAMES principles, where we talk about letting people speak for themselves, emphasizing bottom-up organizing, and really practice. I would definitely say that in terms of practicing self-transformation, and self is both at the individual level and at the institutional level. Like, how do we really examine? And there's some great tool. Actually, APHA is coming out with a great tool around racial justice healing, and how do we integrate this into all of our policies and practices. So people should stay tuned for that, so that we're actually we're not just thinking about, like, some of the groups that one of the groups that I tried to engage, well, they had committed to doing this kind of anti-oppression training, but at the same time, they were like, only ones to do it like for a half day. Isn't a day a bit too much? Or, so recognizing that that we have to really do the work in order to be transformational, and recognizing that that racism is so embedded in as we say, the bones of our society, that there's so much that needs to be done to dismantle it at every step. But that there's also Adrienne Marie Brown, I would also recommend as recommended reading, is this notion of pleasure activism, and that it doesn't have to be, because I think people get overwhelmed by all that's happening, and that we can find joy even in dismantling racism, because a joy is what we see in the promised land once we've actually done it. And yes, it can be rocky along the way, but we need to experience joy in so doing. Otherwise, we will get demoralized along the path. So I just would say, yes, commit to deep transformation, but also remember that we need to do all of this with joy, even amidst the heartbreak. We have to find those glimmers of joy throughout. Thank you.
That's so great. Thank you so much. And yeah, that's such a good reminder. We gotta take care of ourselves and keep the momentum going as well. So thank you again. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Ella.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank you again, Jacqueline, for your time and insight and heart and joy and resources that you brought to to all of us in the past hour, and we tried to capture a lot of it. There is a recording of this event, which will be shared and publicly accessible. We've jotted down a lot of resources that you've noted, and we will provide links to those. And thank you, Van, for hosting the conversation, and the Bar Foundation for their support for this speaker series. Keep your eye out for the next speaker series in July. We'll send more information about that soon. And the final announcement is that we're excited to launch the inaugural Heat Preparedness Week at MAPC this week. So thank you all. This was one of the events. In the chat, there'll be a link to the Heat Preparedness Week webpage, but this is a regional collaborative effort to amplify and elevate this issue of extreme heat in advance of the summer to help municipalities and the public prepare for extreme heat. So please check out those resources. And thank you again so much, Jacqueline Patterson, for joining us today.
Thank you.